In the early years of his political ascendancy, Donald Trump rapidly became known for his America First approach, a slogan that resonated with many voters and stirred controversy on the global stage. As his campaign progressed and eventually culminated in a historic presidential win, Trump's rhetoric on international alliances began to crystallize his skepticism toward long-standing partnerships, particularly with Europe. His criticisms were rooted in a belief that traditional alliances had increasingly taken advantage of American goodwill and burdened the United States with obligations that were no longer reciprocal. Throughout the 2016 campaign, Trump's speeches were punctuated with remarks aimed at exposing what he considered the inequities of international trade and defense arrangements. He repeatedly argued that European nations had been free-riding on American military and economic strength, while contributing too little in return. In these public pronouncements, he contended that the United States had borne an excessive share of NATO's financial and strategic responsibilities. His position was not simply an abstract critique. It was grounded in the real grievances that many of his supporters believed had long undermined U.S. sovereignty. During this period, Trump's narrative was bolstered by examples drawn from decades of U.S. foreign policy. He cited instances where European nations were slow to modernize their defense forces, and when trade imbalances created tension between the economic interests of the United States and its allies. His speeches were filled with appeals to fairness and self-interest, urging that America should no longer subsidize the security of others if those nations were not willing to shoulder a commensurate share of the costs. He warned that failing to rebalance these relationships could eventually lead to America's strategic isolation. One of the most provocative aspects of Trump's rhetoric was his stance on NATO, the cornerstone of transatlantic security. Over the years, he questioned the continued relevance of the alliance, suggesting that NATO members were not living up to their commitments. On numerous occasions, he publicly demanded that European allies increase their defense spending to levels he deemed appropriate. His position was clear. If European countries did not reform their military investments, the United States might reconsider the extent of its involvement in what he described as a lopsided arrangement. This message struck a nerve with many critics and supporters alike, sparking intense debates about the future of the alliance. As the administration took shape, real policy decisions began to reflect these sentiments. The Trump administration introduced new trade tariffs and renegotiated agreements, actions that sent ripples through transatlantic relations. Critics argued that these moves were part of a broader strategy to leverage American power against international institutions and multilateral agreements that, in the view of the new leadership, no longer served U.S. interests. The idea was not merely to withdraw support, but to fundamentally reshape the terms of engagement on issues ranging from trade to security cooperation. Many in Europe watched these developments with unease, questioning whether the United States would continue to honor commitments that had long underpinned the transatlantic order. The narrative of a potential rupture in cooperation was further fueled by a series of public confrontations and exchanges between Trump and European leaders. In one particularly memorable instance, Trump criticized certain European leaders during a press conference, suggesting that their policies were not only detrimental to their own citizens, but also to the broader interests of the West. His language was pointed and unambiguous. He suggested that if Europe continued on its current path, it might find itself increasingly isolated from the most powerful nation on the planet. This rhetoric, though hyperbolic to some, resonated with a segment of the American electorate that felt that international cooperation had, over time, come at too steep a cost. Behind the scenes, advisors and policymakers were forced to grapple with the implications of this new stance. The traditional view of international relations, built on shared values, mutual defense, and collective economic interests, was suddenly up for debate. While many experts warned of the long-term dangers of unraveling such ties, Trump's administration appeared ready to test the limits of American unilateralism. The debates were not confined to halls of government. Media outlets around the world dissected every statement, and diplomatic channels buzzed with speculation about the future of U.S. European relations. At its core, the retelling of these events is one of transformation and tension. The United States, under Trump's leadership, was depicted as reasserting its sovereignty by challenging conventional wisdom that had governed global politics for decades. Europe, for its part, was portrayed as grappling with a new reality, a reality in which the balance of power was shifting and old alliances were being questioned. This reconfiguration of international relations was not an overnight process. Instead, it emerged gradually through a series of calculated policy decisions, fiery speeches, and public showdowns that underscored a broader dissatisfaction with the status quo. Even as the rhetoric grew more intense, there were signs that not everyone in the Trump administration was in full agreement on the direction of U.S. foreign policy. Some officials privately acknowledged that while recalibrating the relationship with Europe might be necessary, a complete withdrawal from multilateral cooperation could have unforeseen and far-reaching consequences. The transatlantic alliance, after all, was not just a tool for immediate gains, but a pillar of long-term stability. However, these internal debates were largely overshadowed by the public narrative, a narrative that emphasized strength, independence, and the uncompromising pursuit of national interest. By the end of this first phase of the administration, the stage had been set for a fundamental rethinking of America's role in the world. Trump's vocal dissatisfaction with European cooperation was more than mere rhetoric. It was a harbinger of policies that would reshape the nature of international engagement. The retelling of these events, then, is not simply a chronicle of words and gestures, but a reflection of a seismic shift in the way power was exercised on the global stage. As the United States began to recalibrate its alliances, the long-established bonds with Europe were put under an unprecedented strain, a strain that would come to define an era of American foreign policy marked by both audacity and controversy. As the administration moved deeper into its term, the consequences of the America First doctrine became increasingly apparent. In this second part of the retelling, we explore the unfolding of events and the reactions from Europe as Trump's administration pushed further toward a more unilateral approach to international relations. Central to this narrative is the mounting tension over trade imbalances, defense spending, and the future of multilateral organizations that had long been the bedrock of transatlantic cooperation. One of the key flashpoints in this evolving drama was a persistent dispute over trade. The Trump administration argued that unfair trading practices by European nations were disadvantaging American workers and industries. This argument was frequently articulated in meetings, interviews, and policy memos, all of which underscored a growing impatience with the existing trade framework. By imposing tariffs and threatening to withdraw from long-standing trade agreements, the administration signaled that it was prepared to take drastic measures to rebalance the scales. These policy shifts were portrayed as necessary corrections to a system that had long favored Europe at America's expense, and they sparked heated debates in both Washington and Brussels. In the arena of defense, Trump's demands for higher military spending by NATO allies became a recurring theme. He contended that the United States had been unfairly shouldering a disproportionate share of the security burden. This critique was not new. It echoed long-standing complaints by American political figures. However, Trump's blunt and often abrasive delivery brought the issue to the forefront of international discourse. His insistence on reining in NATO expenditures was accompanied by veiled threats that failure to comply could lead to a scaling back of American military support in Europe. For many European leaders, this was a wake-up call, a signal that the U.S. might no longer be willing to act as a guarantor of European security without significant concessions. The impact of these policy moves was felt across multiple dimensions of transatlantic relations. On the diplomatic front, high-level meetings between American and European officials took on a new tone, one marked by caution and a growing sense of urgency. European leaders, accustomed to a certain degree of predictability in their relationship with the United States, found themselves forced to re-examine strategies that had worked for decades. In various international forums, they began to advocate more strongly for a European strategic autonomy, an idea that had once been considered fringe but now appeared increasingly viable in the face of shifting American priorities. The media, both in the United States and abroad, played a significant role in shaping public perceptions of this unfolding crisis. Headlines and editorials highlighted the potential long-term consequences of a fracturing transatlantic alliance. Analysts debated whether Trump's policies were a temporary aberration or a sign of a permanent realignment in global power structures. Within Europe, skepticism and frustration grew among citizens and policymakers alike, as they struggled to reconcile their shared history with America against the backdrop of a leader who seemed intent on redefining those ties. The public discourse was filled with questions about the sustainability of a foreign policy based on unilateral decision-making, a policy that risked alienating key allies and undermining decades of cooperative security and economic prosperity. Behind closed doors, the administration's inner circle was divided on the best course of action. Some advisors warned that distancing the United States from Europe could embolden rival powers and destabilize an international order that had long been anchored in collective action. Others believed that a more assertive stance would force Europe to take greater responsibility for its own defense and economic destiny. This internal tug-of-war was emblematic of a broader ideological battle over America's role in the world. On one side stood the traditional view that America's strength was best maintained through alliances and cooperation. On the other, a more radical vision that prioritized American sovereignty and self-interest above all else. As the months passed, the tangible effects of these policies became increasingly difficult to ignore. Military exercises that had once been joint and coordinated began to be reconfigured, with the United States scaling back its involvement in European operations. Trade negotiations, once conducted in the spirit of mutual benefit, took on a more adversarial character. In public statements and interviews, Trump continued to assert that the old ways of transatlantic engagement were obsolete and that a new, more transactional relationship was both inevitable and desirable. This assertion was not without precedent in American political thought, but its expression in the highest office of the land marked a dramatic departure from past practice. By the end of this tumultuous period, the retelling of events had come to symbolize a broader shift in global affairs. The attempts by the Trump administration to reduce cooperation with Europe were seen as both a repudiation of the post-World War II order and a challenge to the enduring norms of international diplomacy. The changes were gradual yet profound, affecting not only policy decisions but also the very language of international relations. As Europe sought to adapt to this new reality, it faced the dual challenges of defending its own interests while preserving a relationship that had long been defined by shared values and mutual commitments. In reflecting on this period, one is struck by the complexity of the forces at work. The drive to curtail transatlantic cooperation was not simply an expression of isolationism. It was part of a broader reimagining of what it meant to be a global leader in an era marked by rapid economic, political, and technological change. The debates that emerged during this time continue to influence discussions about national sovereignty, global responsibility, and the future of alliances. In the final analysis, the events described here represent a critical juncture in international relations, one in which long-established partnerships were tested by a leader determined to reshape the world order in his own image. As the policies of the Trump administration continued to evolve, the long-term impact of his stance on transatlantic cooperation became increasingly clear. The final chapter in this narrative examines the tangible effects and strategic recalibrations that reshaped not only U.S. European relations but also the global order. This phase, marked by both policy shifts and a change in mindset, underscored the complexities of disentangling a partnership that had defined much of the post-World War II era. In the wake of persistent demands for increased European defense spending and tougher trade terms, many European nations embarked on an ambitious process of self-reliance. Recognizing that the traditional security umbrella was no longer guaranteed, several countries accelerated efforts to modernize their armed forces and reduce dependency on American military support. This strategic pivot led to a surge in investments in domestic defense industries and the pursuit of new forms of regional collaboration. European policymakers began to envisage a future where transatlantic ties could evolve into a partnership of equals rather than one marked by a clear hierarchy. Economically, the unilateral trade policies initiated by the Trump administration forced European industries to reassess their reliance on American markets. Negotiations that once emphasized mutual benefit became arenas of hard bargaining, as each side sought to extract concessions. While tariffs and trade barriers briefly disrupted economic flows, they also catalyzed a broader conversation about diversification and resilience. In response, several European nations intensified efforts to negotiate alternative trade agreements with emerging economies, aiming to balance the influence of traditional partners and mitigate the risks of overdependence. Diplomatically, the recalibration of the transatlantic relationship sparked a series of reforms within international institutions. With the United States signaling a willingness to withdraw from multilateral commitments, European countries recognized the urgency of fortifying regional frameworks. Initiatives to strengthen the European Union's strategic autonomy gained traction, as leaders sought to ensure that the continent could independently manage security challenges and economic crises. This reorientation was not an outright rejection of transatlantic ties, but a pragmatic acknowledgement that global challenges required more diversified alliances. At the same time, the Trump administration's approach also served as a cautionary tale for future American foreign policy. While the America First doctrine resonated with a segment of the domestic electorate, it left behind a legacy of uncertainty among allies. The push for recalibration revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities inherent in a system that had long depended on shared commitments and mutual trust. The fallout from these policy shifts not only altered diplomatic protocols, but also reshaped public perceptions of international cooperation. European citizens, once assured by a long-standing alliance with America, found themselves questioning the sustainability of a system that could be upended by the rhetoric of a single leader. Ultimately, this phase of transformation highlighted a crucial lesson. The dynamics of global leadership are in constant flux, and the recalibration of alliances can redefine the geopolitical landscape. As the dust settled, both the United States and Europe were compelled to re-examine their priorities and forge a new path forward, one that balanced national sovereignty with the realities of a deeply interconnected world. This final chapter in the narrative of Trump's policies serves as a lasting reminder that even the most enduring alliances must adapt in the face of evolving global challenges.